Good afternoon, class. My name is Charles Peterson, and I'll be your instructor for today. And we're going to cover a few topics such as post and contract for employer responsibilities, and we'll touch on we'll touch on the table that talks about limited approach and restricted approach boundaries. Um, Again, my name is Charles Peterson, and I'll be your instructor. Some of my background and experiences. I've been with companies such as Meta, which I currently work for as an electrical subject matter expert. Um, Before Meta, I worked at a company called BASF, which is a large chemical manufacturer. There, I worked as a lead design engineer. And before that, I worked for Eaton Corporation. Some of you guys may be familiar with Eaton's low voltage switchgear products, transformer products, maybe possibly relaying and VFDs. Um, at Eaton, I worked as a field service engineer and an applications engineer. So I have plenty of 20 years of experience in manufacturing and working in design roles and maintenance and reliability. So today we're going to cover a couple of topics in NFPA 70E for electrical safety, starting with host and contract employer responsibility. So as a host employer, usually that's the company, that's a company representative or someone designated by the company uh, to work with maybe possibly vendors to get projects taken care of. So the host employer and some of the responsibilities of the host employer would be to inform contract employers of the following uh, requirements. So known hazards that are covered by this standard that are related to contract employers' work and that might be recognized by the contract employer as its employees. Two, information about the employer's installation that the contract employer needs to make assessments required by Chapter 1. Two would be host employer shall report observed contract employer related violations of the standard to contract employer. I know when I was working as a field service engineer, one of the first things I wanted to know about as being a contract employer working for a host employer is, where are my lockout points? Where are my uh, points of isolation to protect me in the work that I'm going to be doing? So, single line drawings, maybe um, some other type of drawings and manuals that you may need to help figure out different nuances of the equipment, uh, to help you work safe as possible. Um, and then the contract employer responsibility. So the contract employer should ensure that each of his or her employees is instructed in the hazards communicated to the contract employer by the host employer. This instruction shall be in addition to the basic training required by this standard. So the contract employer shall advise the host employer of the following. Any unique hazards presented by the contract employer's work, hazards identified during the course of the work by contract employer that, that were not communicated by the host employer. So, that could be surprises that you run into that you didn't think you would, after you've had briefings with the host employer and you guys talked about some of the hazards that you thought you would encounter, and then, maybe some surprises out there in the field that you just run into later. Three, the measures the contractor took to correct any violations reported by the host employer on the 110.3A2 and to prevent such violation from occurring in the future. So one of the key things we just talked about earlier, documentation. So where the host employer has knowledge of hazards covered by the standard, they're related to the contract employer's work. There should be documented meetings between the host employer and the contract employer. So that could be a briefing where you guys discuss single line drawings and lockout points, things of that nature. So we're gonna go down and look at limited approach and restricted approach boundaries. You'll find this in Article 130, Table 130.4D, which covers shock protection for AC, alternating current systems. And then there's a 130.4DB, which covers direct current voltage systems, so your DC systems. So in these tables, like I said, it's going to cover limited and restricted approach boundaries. The first column is going to have your nominal system voltage. So that's the voltage of the system that you're going to be working on. And that's a phase-to-phase voltage in this case. The next column will be exposed movable conductors. And as you can see, that has a superscript of a C. So we'll follow that down to see, what do they mean by exposed movable conductors? So we'll read that in this table. Exposed movable conductor describes a condition in which the distance between the conductor and a person is not under the control of the person. So this term is usually applied to overhead lines, conductors supported by poles. So that'd be your distribution systems that are on poles. And those cables have the ability to move. So that's what's covered in this column for exposed movable conductors. Exposed fixed circuit parts. So that'll be breakers, fuses within enclosures, whether that be a panel board, switchboard, or maybe a low voltage piece of switchgear. And then you have your restricted approach boundary, which includes inadvertent movement adder. So this, when you talk about restricted approach, that's when you're inside the equipment at that point. You're actually touching components or doing some type of testing or taking voltage readings and measurements. And as you can see, most of your low voltage equipment, I think most of you said that you work on systems that are 480 volts and below. So, if you look at any of your arc flash labels in the field, limited and restricted approach, these values that you see in the chart based on those voltage levels, your labels should line up with what you see here. So let's take, for example, we have a system that's 480 volts that are falling between this 151 and 750 volt category. If you would go over to limited approach boundary for exposed fixed circuit parts in the panel board, switchboard, what have you, it's going to be 3 feet 6 inches. No matter what piece of equipment it is, if it's in this voltage range, that limited approach is going to be 3 feet 6 inches. The restricted approach, it's going to be 1 foot, so 12 inches. And that's for any system voltage level with the arc flash label that's within these voltage ranges. And if you go down to the DC chart, it's pretty much the same thing here. Same thing with, we got a nominal potential difference. So that's the voltage level that you'll be working on at the DC level. Again, exposed movable conductors, those would fall into the category of your overhead conductors that are distributed. Your exposed fixed circuit parts, again, that falls into the panel board, switchboard category. And then you have your restricted approach boundary again, where you're touching the equipment at that point. And as you can see, if we're looking at some voltage between 50 volts and 300 volts, for example, if you go over to this limited approach column, it's 3 feet 6 inches. Restricted approach, it just says to avoid contact. So you could be wearing PPE rated for that category based on your arc flash label. And you want to avoid contact there. There's no distance, no required distance for you to adhere to at that level. For limited approach though, again, you have 3 feet 6 inches. So that'll be the limited approach boundary that you would use for that nominal voltage. So I want to thank you guys for joining me for the brief period where we just covered host and contract employer responsibilities and covering limits and approach boundaries on tables 130 that 4D A and that 4D B for your alternating systems and DC and direct current system. Thank you again for joining.